The next two speakers, Dr. Elin Royals and Dr. Hugh Lewis, come from the International Politics Department of Aberystwyth University. Elin's main fields of research include language policy and language planning, and her studies of regional and minority languages in Europe have contributed towards an increase in interest in language policy from the point of view of political science. Some trivia for you. Elin's mum was Colin's Welsh teacher at Ysgol Rhydfalen. Hugh's fields of expertise cover areas such as language policy, language revitalisation, Welsh politics and modern political philosophy. Colin was the examiner for Hugh's doctorate thesis in 2009, and they've worked together regularly ever since. So, I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you very much. We're doing a bit of a double act today. I'll start, and I hope this is going to work. So we're going to speak about innovation and good practice, modern tendencies and challenges for governance and civil society. But first of all, we want to thank Colin as well for being so supportive of our research and giving us such good advice and being so willing to share your own research as well. Our experience reflects the experiences of so many other people who are here today and also people who are not here, people from the academic world and people who work in policy and campaigners and grassroots campaigners as well. It's dangerous sometimes to try and summarise such a huge academic contribution, but we wanted to bring your attention to some things that we felt were key. You have established so many different ways of researching. You were a multidisciplinary researcher before that even became fashionable. Language policy and language planning are not just a matter for social linguistics, but they are relevant to all areas, and that's made such a difference to how this is viewed internationally. Something else that is key is ensuring that language policy in Wales was discussed in a relative context. We've seen you doing that today, the emphasis on comparing and the benefit we can all get from considering different cases despite the differences between them. You're also very clear on your viewpoints. We can all learn, but we all have to face different challenges from different situations. And finally, and we've also seen this today, you connect questions regarding language revitalisation to big questions and more wider tendencies. For example, language equality and social justice, language connection and public good, the idea that you've discussed today. Over to Hugh. Hopefully I can use the clicker. The context for our comments and questions today is, first of all, the fact that internationally there have been increasing efforts to revitalise languages over the last few decades, and in a number of contexts that means real grassroots work that is led by the language communities themselves. But in the context of Europe, partly because of processes such as devolution or regionalisation, we've seen a tendency for sub-state governments taking more and more responsibilities for leading on these language revitalisation efforts. That's certainly been the experience in Wales, but that's also reflected in places like Scotland and beyond, in countries like the Basque Country and Catalonia in Spain. From the point of view of those who are interested in the future of minority languages such as Welsh, Gaelic, etc., it is something to celebrate. It's a sign of success of campaigning this increasing institutionalisation and language revitalisation as a project. And as a result of that, we've seen the use of legislation and also introducing a variety of strategies and also increasing use of public money to support this as a project. But at the same time, the process of gradually turning language revitalisation into a government policy project raises a number of challenges. challenges and questions in itself. And those are questions for people working in the field, whether in government or outside government. And what we'd like to do in the little time that we have this afternoon is to consider those questions and challenges. And very appropriately, I have a quote from Colin himself, which offers a good starting point for our discussion. It's on the screen. I'm not sure if Colin will remember this, and he may disagree now, but it comes from a speech that Colin gave in a conference held in Brussels in 2019. A number of people here today were also present at that conference, and the theme that Colin focused on at the time was about language revitalisation in the early 21st century. And there's quite a lot of things in this quote that is worth thinking about. The argument was that there was a tendency to treat language revitalisation as an autonomous process in a rather mechanistic fashion without due regard for pressing contextual issues. And it's certainly worth considering that because, as I said, there has been increasing institutionalisation and language revitalisation has become more of a government policy development, and that has offered opportunities to improve, to analyse, to evaluate and really professionalising language revitalisation as a field. But we also need to remember that language revitalisation in its essence is a project that requires people to be aware of macro processes, contextual macro processes. And to reflect on this type of question and to try and bring your attention to these types of tendencies and how they have an impact on language revitalisation today. We were both involved with Wilson MacLeod in a project, and there were other contributions from many other people in the room, including John Walsh and Colin himself. And some of the conclusions of that project tried to emphasise was that there have been so many social macro changes in modern society. For example, the evolution of the family and the fact that it's become more complex and the implications of that for language transmission, for example, and the change in social networking and social life and the implications of promoting the use of language. And also, as we've heard this morning, the fact that we live in an era of international migration and the implication that has on promotion of language procurement and how we view who these new speakers are. These macro changes are something we need to keep in mind. And that, if you like, is the first challenge that we'd like to emphasise in this presentation. The fact that language revitalisation, for those who are involved in that work within government or external to government, there is a tension because at the same time it means to a great extent you have to try and stand against some of the major changes of modern times, but at the same time you can't ignore those changes because often they have implications to how people live their lives and connect with each other. And in the end of the day, by trying to promote more use of language, we're trying to have an impact on those patterns. So that's the first challenge that we'd like to emphasise, and it's something we've discussed in previous work. I'm going to turn back now to Elin, who's going to talk about more specific elements. Thank you, Hugh. So in this time when sub-state governments are increasingly leading on language revitalisation, here are some of the modern challenges that we wanted to bring up. They're quite relevant to Wales, but I hope that they're relevant beyond Wales as well. We have spoken about celebrating success, but the Minister also raised questions about how we can improve what we are doing as well. And first of all, as Colin mentioned this morning, the most important challenge is to increase the use of language. And we've seen an increasing emphasis on encouraging use. And this creates a balance between promoting procurement but also promoting use of language. And I think there's always a risk with the target of reaching 1 million speakers that could be taken to mean that the government just wants to increase the numbers, but that's not actually fair because there was an emphasis in the second part of the strategy on increasing use as well, and that element is so crucial specific targets involved with use of language. We have to ensure the viability of Welsh language communities as places to facilitate the use of language in all ways of life, but also an emphasis on encouraging people to use their language in their social life, in workplace and in public services. So this emphasis on encouraging use in different areas is very, very important, and I look forward to seeing further steps being taken and specific interventions in specific areas following the recommendation of the Commission for Welsh Communities. Another aspect of maturity of language policy is the good practice of combining legislative tools and strategic planning to realise aims. This is a response to the opportunity to plan holistically and do what is appropriate for governments to try and withstand language shift. It's also a response to public expenditure as the ability of governments to fund interventions becomes less of a possibility sometimes. I think the example of Welsh education strategic plans of increasing the necessity to plan through statutes and regulations shows the potential of how we can respond to an unwillingness to move towards more purposeful planning by using legal tools. At the same time, while specific legislation involving language is important, but there's also another challenge in trying to integrate linguistic considerations into a range of other policy fields, and trying to work across policy areas is very challenging, especially in areas such as health or the economy development. And do we fully understand how to respond to this challenge, which involves not only the government in Wales but also the UK government in Westminster? Colin has also already spoken about the potential of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in this context, because it makes different departments, it obliges different departments to consider language, but have they actually taken that fully on board? I'm not sure. And that includes some of the evidence we've seen from the Commissioner for Future Generations. There has been a lot of work happening, a lot of very good work, but there are some areas where we could go further, especially in those complex, difficult areas which are sensitive, many of them connected to the private sphere, which are not simple to operate in, but they are key to withstand and try to change language shift. For example, what further comparisons could be developed to respond purposefully to the problems with the decrease in language use within families and language loss because it's not transmitted from one generation to another? Or is there more that we could do to respond to the challenges presented by immigration? We heard this morning about the private sector challenges. One thing that struck me by the work of Cynnog and Rhian in North Wales was the role the private sector plays in the provision of leisure services, for example. How can we intervene in a more purposeful way? And my last point is that some of the challenges to positive implementation emphasises the attitude of individuals and political will to realise language policy aims. We need that goodwill, and that will have a major impact. Colin's study across Western Europe showed the degree to which civil servants could be so key to cause change to actually happen from the government's point of view. So there are some people working very hard, fighting on the inside, and some of their colleagues can't fully appreciate the effects of that in the same way, and that's true on all sorts of levels of government. And our work has emphasised the degree to which political will has such a huge influence on language policy. So how do we ensure a more positive attitude towards regional languages and minority languages? We know that there is passive support. But how can we develop that further is the idea of strengthening our understanding of importance of the public good, as Colin suggested, and Cassim mentioned that as well. Are there other techniques that we could use to ensure that the political will and those positive attitudes are there to ensure that some of the policies are really put into practice?
One slide to conclude then, one challenge in a way, another challenge to refer to briefly to conclude is, because I stated at the beginning, the fact that the progress that we've seen within the role of governmental bodies and taking on more responsibility for endeavours around language revitalisation really are something to be welcomed by those individuals who've campaigned and called for that in the arena. But at the same time, as that has happened, there's scope to pause and evaluate the possible implications that this may have to the contribution that is just as important as to the civil society and the wider language movement. So what are the implications for the more prominent role of public authorities and public funding in language revitalisation, for innovation and energy and independence, the wider language movement? So this is something that Colin referred to during his address this morning, and it's an important question. It's important because though the lead role of public authorities and government bodies may be introducing and delivering strategies or investing public funding in the overall project of language revitalisation. Language revitalisation is always going to be a project which also demands public involvement in general terms to populate, if you like, public population, because as I mentioned earlier, what one seeks to do, what we're trying to do is trying to influence the practices of individuals or families' lives. And that task is always going to be something that government, or indeed any kind of version of a body or another arm's length body, can lead on that alone. So really what I'm saying is that there's a need to bear in mind the fact that language revitalisation needs to be as much of a social movement as it needs to be by way of a public policy activity. If we consider that further, and maybe with sight on the kind of contributions that we have seen and we can hope to see from civil society alongside government in trying to push language revitalisation endeavours forward, we can think in the first instance that it means considering across three possible options. I'm not saying that this encapsulates everything, but it's a way of starting to think about this. Firstly, that organisations, if we think about the Wales context, again, as Colin referred to this morning, organisations that used to work independently at a grassroots level from the bottom up, if they were to become more to being partners of government, partners through trying to implement some of the strategies or interventions that form part of the National Language Strategy, such as formal providers, if you like, of some of those interventions. On the other hand, we can also see organisations who see their respective work as being advocates and bringing pressure around further policy changes, and that's very appropriate. But at the same time, there is an ongoing need for civil society and the language organisations and movements to be involved in the wider social activity, which is grassroots activity, which is more organic, working possibly through organisations or societies or associations at a local level, such as sports clubs and so forth. If we consider carefully the current context, there may be scope for us to ask, are we striking the right balance between those three elements in terms of the involvement of language organisations and the general endeavour to ensure that there's language revitalisation? Again, echoing what Colin said this morning, it's possible to argue that the work model that we've seen developed, not only here in Wales but in a number of different cases, is that there's an increasing number of language organisations who see the basis for their activities relating to ensuring public investment in maintaining and supporting activity. I'm not criticising for a moment that kind of modus operandi, or indeed asking for any revisitation of the commitment of commitment by public sector into this kind of activity. But at the same time, I would like to suggest that there may be further questions to be asked around that if the aim in an event such as this today is to consider where someone goes or where this is taken over the coming years or decades, to what extent is the current balance between civil society around language revitalisation and government? To what extent are they ensuring enough independence for grassroots organisations? To what extent, similarly, how is that balance one which motivates sufficient opportunity or promotes sufficient opportunity to experiment with new methods and at the same time permitting sufficient opportunities for interventions to support the Welsh language that have a more organic aspect to them rather than more organisational aspects, with an eye specifically on the situation here in Wales and what we know about public expenditure over the coming years and what's likely to be seen there. To what extent then is the current balance one that ensures sufficient resilience in the wider language movement? I know that these are difficult questions. They're not easy questions to answer, and they're not questions that we necessarily have ready answers for, but they are ones that I feel it would pay us to look at. And Colin, I'll conclude on this. Colin said that there was a tendency to turn towards Catalonia, to looking at how we can use social capital of a different kind and economic capital of a different kind to support language revitalisation methods. Perhaps that's not been as much of a tradition here in Wales for good reason, but I feel that there is a need to consider this question in looking towards the future. So we will conclude with that challenge. Thank you.